Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight's program is presented by the Konikoff Center for Learning at the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater in partnership with PJ Our Way in Tidewater and as a part of the Leon Bernard Jaffe Family Jewish Book Festival. My name is Elise Cardin. I am a longtime member of the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater's Holocaust Commission, but most of my time is currently spent raising our 4 children. Our son Avi is a middle schooler. He's in 7th grade, so just a little older than the 2 main characters in the amazing book, Crushing the Red Flowers. Between those fun facts and the lesser known one of me being an aspiring author, it was an easy yes when I was asked if I could host tonight's event. Before I introduce you to Jennifer, a few housekeeping items. This event is in webinar format, which means that you will only be able to see those who are presenting. We will be leaving 15 minutes at the end of this program for questions. If you have a question for the author, please type it in the Q&A, not the chat, the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as possible. And now to introduce Jennifer. Jennifer Voigt Kaplan is an award-winning author. Her debut novel, Crushing the Red Flowers, won a 2020 Christopher Award in the Books for Young People category. It was also recognized in 6 literary contests before its publication. Jennifer was born in Germany, raised in Philadelphia, and now resides in the New York City area. On behalf of our Tidewater community, a big welcome to you, Jennifer. We are so thrilled you are here.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here. Welcome to my author talk, everybody. As you just heard, my name is Jennifer Voigt Kaplan, and I'm a children's book writer. Today, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, my debut novel, my research, and also outline some writing techniques that you may find useful and interesting. So my debut novel, Crushing the Red Flowers, ta-da! It was released last year in 2019 by IG Publishing. It's been endorsed by James Patterson, and I was so excited when it recently won the 2020 Christopher Award. The novel is set in 1938 Germany. It's about how ordinary children cope under the extraordinary circumstances of the pogrom we call Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass. The story is fictional, but it is based on my own true family experiences. So the book alternates perspectives between 2 12-year-olds, Emil, a German Jewish boy, and Friedrich, a boy in the Hitler's Jungvolk. And I wrote this book because my heritage is half German and half German Jewish. The novel starts and stops in 1938, and I chose very specifically to structure the story this way to provide middle grade readers with a good introduction to the factors that led up to World War II and to the Holocaust. So let's get started. I'll just give you a very quick background about me as a writer. My path to writing was long and winding. I was born in Germany, and I was introduced to 2 languages, German and English, very early on. I then moved to the United States when I was about 3 and a half, and I was introduced to a 3rd language, Hebrew, when I attended a Jewish day school for a few years. And I'd always been creative and loved storytelling, but it really wasn't until I was adult that I got my footing firmly into language and I started writing. And I've always had many ideas, really too many ideas, very disorganized ideas, and I never really knew what to do with them until I started dabbling in writing. And I began to write picture books for my own children just for enjoyment. And then I got a little bit more serious about learning the craft, and I moved to short stories. And these are a great learning tool because they teach the art of a proper beginning, middle, and end. And that ultimately helped me to springboard my way into writing novels. And writing just felt right. It was the first creative pursuit that gave me a way to organize and use my literally hundreds of ideas. So from the very beginning, I created what I called an idea repository, which is basically just like one big massive Excel document with a million different tabs to hold all of my thoughts. And I have pages for character traits and for book ideas. great lines and weird concepts and verbs I love, and anything and everything that I could use in my writing. But it also gave me a way to capture my ideas before they disappeared. I've been blessed with an overactive creative muse, but she's also a very fickle creative muse. And she's super productive at weird times and never productive at the times that I need her to be. So when she's working, I need to make sure that I capture everything she says, because if I don't, I'll just forget it all 5 seconds later. So getting back to finding my way into novel writing, for me, based on my family heritage, it was clear that Crushing the Red Flowers would have to be my first novel. As I mentioned, I'm half German and half German Jewish, and I grew up in the United States with this multi-layered understanding of what Jewish and non-Jewish residents of Germany faced during World War II. And advice 101 for writers is that to use what you know. And the material in Crushing the Red Flowers was something that I knew because it was my own family history and heritage. And I was inspired by all the stories growing up that I heard around the dinner table. I tried to include as many of these as possible. And, I know not everyone has read the book, so I won't give away any spoilers in my talk. But I'll just give you one small example now. So I had grown up hearing this one family story that it was sad, but at the same time it was really funny to me, and I felt like I somehow needed to just document it. So apparently my great grandmother had a cousin who was quarantined for months due to some illness, and we can all relate now to what it's like to be quarantined. But this individual was quarantined for a while, and by the end of his isolation, he used to catch flies and paint them all different colors of the rainbow, and then just let them zip around the room just for entertainment. And I thought that was hilarious, and I love that story. And it took me a while, but I found a very small way just to add that into my novels as a funny little thing. So another reason why I wanted to write about this period in time was growing up in the United States, I often experienced a lot of misunderstanding about World War II from my peers. And I always felt like I wanted to better address it. And I received a lot of questions that surprised me about German people and about Jewish people. So when I was preparing to write my novel, I looked at what was available in the market at that time. And there really wasn't that much available in the middle grade section for World War II literature overall. And I'm not really sure there's anything that just focused on Kristallnacht for this age group. And there were just very few children's books that use German main characters. So one of my favorite quotes on writing is by Toni Morrison, and I'm going to read this to you. She says, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. So that's exactly what I did. And as I wrote, the project evolved. I started out wanting to capture meaningful portions of my family history, but I also wanted to explore the factors that led up to World War II, and I wanted to shed light on the evolution of hate. And I wanted to give these younger middle grade readers an authentic introduction to the Holocaust with diverse points of view. And I wanted to do this all while not overly distressing them. And importantly, I wanted to invite my younger readers to reflect on their own lives. And I want them to think about learning from our past and think about what we can do to move forward. Okay, so let's talk about research. A lot of people have asked me about the research that I conducted, and I love talking about this topic. I felt very strongly that if I was going to take on a Holocaust project, which is a project about one of the most disturbing periods of history, that I needed to make sure my research was solid, and I needed to proceed with extra care and caution and commit to not taking any shortcuts. So as I mentioned, my family stories really served as the foundation and inspiration for Crushing the Red Flowers, but I also conducted so much additional research beyond that. When I started writing on the novel, I was fortunate that I still had 4 family members who had lived through that time period. They were still with me. I had my 2 German Jewish maternal grandparents, and I had my paternal German aunt and uncle. And all 4 of these people were huge champions of the project, and the interviews that I conducted with them became the foundation of the novel. So I then tried to learn everything I could about 1938 Germany. I read nonfiction and children's fiction and adult fiction. I read academic articles. But as I worked on the novel, I still had questions. So, for example, how exactly did the events of Kristallnacht unfold? What was the timeline? And how could someone leave Germany after securing a visa? What was that timeline like? What was involved with getting the visa? What foods were starting to become difficult to obtain? And I brought in my sense of my scope of sources, and I contacted historians like Myrna Goldenberg, professor emerita for Holocaust history at the Montgomery College, and Dr. Patricia Herber Rice from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. But then, even beyond that, I had some very, very specific questions that I needed answers to, like what was the weather like on certain dates? And what exact fish could live in the Lina River? What was the month that poppy flowers wilted? And I continued my research to gain like a richer sense of German style and interiors, and just the general mood of the 1930s in Germany. I watched movies from that time period, and I browsed through portraits housed at the Center for Jewish History in New York. And I even watched old 1930s political clips. So I'll give you one example about my research. One time I had a very, very specific question about what German wallpaper in the 1930s looked like. And I couldn't really find the answer in the sources that I already had. And, I didn't want to just make it up. I didn't want to make assumptions. So I hopped on the train to New York, and I went to the New York Public Library picture collection. And there I was able to browse through hundreds of images of German interiors from the 1930s until I got my answer. And that all that bit of research probably took a day, and it all got boiled down to maybe one word, which was like swirly. So moving on, people also ask me about my characters, and the majority of Crushing the Red Flowers characters are completely fictional. And to me, they're a sort of representation of a very specific place and time. Again, and I'm going to mention my characters, and I will try not to give away any spoilers. So there's Emil, who is a main character. Emil, his father and sister, Sarah and Fatih, they're all fictional. Friedrich, the other main character, and his papa, they're fictional as well. With all of these characters, I try to capture a certain kind of warmth and a certain degree of coldness that I personally have sometimes felt growing up in relation to my Jewish roots and my German roots. The side character Ari is totally fictional, but he was inspired by stories of how my grandfather, my Jewish grandfather and grandmother were treated and how they thought about it. And specifically when some of their friends began to distance themselves from them because they were Jewish. Gunther and the Jungfuck boys, they are the villains in the story. They are completely made up. And I used historical research to assemble each character. Mama, who is Emil's mother, she is fictional, but she has this warmth and physical appearance, and she has a loving marriage to her husband. They were all inspired by stories my grandfather told me about his mother. Mother, who is the mother of Friedrich, the other of the two main characters, is completely fictional, but to me, she remains one of the most interesting characters. She compulsively cleans, and she's actually teetering on the edge of madness. To me, she represents a part of the German subconscious. So years ago, I once read this really interesting article, not about the Holocaust, it was about mental illness in women throughout the years. And it compared conditions commonly associated with women, like agoraphobia and modern day eating disorders. And what was really interesting to me was that the author explored how each of these conditions was manifesting itself in a way that was just an exaggerated version of the supposedly ideal woman of that particular time period. And I found that whole notion fascinating. And so I used that logic to create Mother's Condition. I imagined what the ideal German woman in 1938 would be like, which I think would be someone who followed orders and someone who served her family and someone who kept a very, very, very clean house. And then I used that all to create her disorder. So the characters are fictional and are just vaguely inspired by a true characteristic here and there. Then how, you asked, how do I develop them? And I'll tell you, I use something called a characterization grid, which is pretty much what every writer does. And for if there are any tweens and teens out there, perhaps you've already done this in school for your own writing project. So I hope what I'm going to show you will be helpful to you. So what this means is I create a full write-up on each and every character, not just the main characters, each and every character before I start to write. So I am going to share my screen to show you the characterization grid. So you should be seeing something called a characterization grid. And I start with the basics, like age and what they look like, and speech and physical mannerisms. Now, keep in mind, I'm a children's writer, and I do write children's books, so a lot of these questions are geared to be applicable to children characters. Then after the basics, I think about what my character is like, stuff like strengths and weaknesses, or hobbies, or friends, or possessions. And then finally, I really get to know them by fleshing out the things like, what are they most proud of? What's their most embarrassing moment? What are their secrets? And most importantly, what are their wants, desires, and goals? And that stuff is really the most important. And that's the stuff that propels any novel forward, adult or children's novel. So doing this not only helps me develop my characters, but it also helps me flesh out my plot. And I will mention that I think it's important, again, that to do this for all the characters, not just the main character. And I made this mistake when I first started writing the novel. I had only worked out my two main characters, Emil and Friedrich. Then a little while into writing, I went through this characterization exercise for all my side characters, and I got some really great stuff from it. Again, I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but when I did this exercise for the character Mother, who I just spoke about, Friedrich's mother, I found out she has a huge secret. And I guess I knew this all along and it was in my subconscious, but it really didn't come out until I went through this actual exercise. And her secret made it into the book, and I think the book is that much better for it. So while we're on the topic of writing tools, in addition to the characterization grid, I also love using something called a Post-it note plotter. And I will share this. It is so old school and I love it. I find visual plotting very helpful. So what I do is I take a large poster board and I use lots of different color Post-it notes, and I basically map everything out before I start to write. This can take days or weeks or hopefully not months, but it could take months. But I would not shortcut this either. So for setting, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor up here. For setting, I use a large pale sticky note on top. For characters, I use a series of mini blue Post-it notes. For general plot, I use the more yellow Post-it notes. For questions and stuff I still need to figure out, I use purple Post-it notes. And it's okay if you're working on a large creative project to not have every little thing figured out from the start. I actually think it's good to keep a degree of spontaneity in your writing. And then for the big plot points, which is the most important part of this exercise, I use orange Post-it notes. You capture your inciting incident sort of in the beginning, you capture your climax, your plot twist, any other big plot event that keeps readers surprised and turning the page and at the end of the seats, at the edge of their seats. So I actually use this Post-it note plotting board not only as a plotting tool, but I use it as a diagnostic tool. And that helps me to identify problems early on. So specifically, I make sure I have plenty of orange Post-it notes scattered throughout. If I don't see an orange one after a few chapters, I know my writing is sagging and I need to beef up the plot. So what you're looking at right now is a very early version of a Post-it note plotter. And it actually told me that I had a problem. There weren't enough orange Post-it notes. So let me show you another version. This is the same creative project, and it may look like a hot mess to you, but it's a much more organized place for all my thoughts to be, not in my head. So it's certainly more populated. It has more notes on the character's internal journey. It has more notes on the book's external plot. It still remains just as helpful with diagnosing plot problems. And to be honest, for example, I see a huge area right in the middle with a plot problem. I don't see an orange sticky here, and so that would alert me to address it. Okay, moving on. I'm often asked about what I like to use for writing inspiration, and my answer, of course, is many things, but I often use other art forms for writing inspiration. And what I mean by other art forms, it could be music, it could be visual arts like painting or photography or sculptures. It could be performing arts like theaters or dance or movies. So for example, let's take paintings. What I do is I look at a piece that I've had a connection with, and then I ask myself, why am I having an emotional response? And I dissect it. And when I move from the emotional to the analytical, that's when I can better observe and describe. And there are so many advantages to using art to feed writing. For one, a place or experience may become more accessible than it otherwise would not have been. So let me show you what I mean. You should be looking at a picture of a cottage. This is Dawn Hudson's Country Cottage. So if you're writing a story about a cottage in the woods, but you can't actually get to a cottage in the woods, how will you know how to describe it in your writing? You'll probably already have a mental image, but by dissecting a painting or a photograph of a cottage, you may find additional sensory details like soft light illuminating from within, or the winding path to the entrance, or perhaps fragrant flowers that are overflowing from window boxes. Or maybe you'll notice how smoke billows from the chimney, or there are birds nesting on the thatched roof. You may notice details about the cottage's surroundings, like maybe the evergreens. They tower over it and they block its sun. Or maybe you just pick up cues about the sounds that you would likely hear, like birds or rustling leaves or water, or maybe an echoey chatter. And all of these details inform writing descriptions. And you can also use portraits. Let me show you another example. Here is one by Rembrandt, and it's called Portrait of Herman Dummer, painted in 1640. This man's expression really caught my eye. To me, it's a wee bit snarky and perhaps even accusatory. And I'm nearly 100% certain that this is not what Rembrandt was going for, but to me, I swear he looks like he just caught me doing something I'm not supposed to be doing. It looks like his next words to me are, "You are so busted." So this is the kind of look that one of my characters, Emil, who's very good natured, but he often lacks in common sense. This is the kind of look that he would often be getting from adults. So how can we use portraits in writing? So if you're writing about an adult catching you in a lie, find a painting that reminds you of the look that you would get and dissect the facial expressions. So in this case, maybe you would mention the eyes. They're certainly alert and piercing, or maybe the mouth, it's slightly agape, or maybe the laugh lines around his eyes and mouth that appear kind of mocking. They're pronounced. They're almost making it look like he's about in the beginning of a smirk. This painting is 400 years old, but you can use it to help you describe your character's body language in your writing today. Okay, so let's go back to, you should not be seeing my shared screen. You should be seeing me now. And okay, getting back. So when I was writing Crushing the Red Flowers, I also used art in a number of ways. For one, I used music for inspiration. As you know, Jewish people in Germany were fairly integrated into society before the 1930s. Policies and attitudes definitely began shifting throughout the 30s, but very, very abruptly, all within the year 1938, Jewish people experienced radical changes. And specifically, the government took steps to weaken the position of Jews, a group of their own citizens. And they did this by using economic and social tactics, not just political tactics. And I'm going to give you a list of some of these in a second. But if you did want to reflect more on this, you can review a timeline that I've compiled of selected events on my website. It's on the Educational Resources tab at jennifervk.com. So I'm going to read you a list now. And mind you, all of these happened just in the year 1938 alone. Okay, so Jews were prohibited from having driver's license, were banned from public streets on certain days, were forced to register wealth and property, register their business, prohibited from trading, were forced to carry identification cards, were prohibited from practicing medicine, were required to add Sarah if a woman, add Israel if a man to their names on all legal documents, were prohibited from all legal practices, were forced to have their passport stamps with a large red J, were fully expelled from German schools and were no longer permitted to attend universities. So that's a lot. That's all in 1 year. That's a lot. And thinking about all this as I wrote, I was influenced by a musical piece by Bohuslav Martinu. He was a Czech composer who was blacklisted by the Nazis because he composed a tribute to a Czech resistance force. And during the war, he actually made his way out to the United States. But while he was here, he had a very odd accident and he fractured his skull and he was in tremendous pain for some time. During this time period, he wrote a piece called the Three Madrigals. It's beautiful, but this piece is riddled with irritability and frustration and angst. And listening to it reminded me of what the German Jewish people must have felt in 1938 as they systematically had their freedoms taken away. And I also used photographs for inspiration. In my research, I found some fantastic old photographs that illustrated what people went through before the war. Germany was financially devastated after World War I, and we really saw this manifest itself during a period, it's called extreme hyperinflation, and that was during around the early 1920s. And money became nearly worthless. And it was so bad that people were using banknotes to wallpaper their houses because it was cheaper than using actual wallpaper. And waiters had to announce menu prices throughout the day because of the inflation, and workers had to bring sacks to collect their wages because it was just such a large bulk. And many Germans even forgot about currency. They tried to avoid it altogether, and instead they started to resort to the barter system. So I will share my screen again to show you a picture. So I found a few old photographs from around 1922, 1923. One was of children using thousands and thousands of bundled banknotes as building blocks, and another one was of boys flying a kite made of banknotes. And now you may ask, okay, your book is about 1938. Why are you talking about 1923? And that is a fair question. 1938 is about 15 years later than that period of hyperinflation. So many of the children that I saw in these photographs would have been decision makers and maybe even parents by 1938. And my feeling was that if I was going to write a book about what happened in 1938, I needed to understand what happened before and specifically how desperate times had gotten for the Germans. And these images gave me insight into the mentality of the time, and specifically they gave me a glimpse into what the people who ushered in Adolf Hitler had gone through when they were children. And I thought that was important for me to understand as I wrote my book. So lastly, I wanted to mention how I used paintings from that era for inspiration. There are a few, but I will talk about just one or two. I found this self-portrait by Oskar Kokoschka. He's an Austrian artist, and he painted this in 1937. He was in the process of painting a self-portrait, and he learned, during that time, he learned that a number of his other pieces were included in the Nazis' degenerative art expedition. And he was obviously affronted, and his response was to change directions of his self-portrait. So he continued to paint it, but he crossed his arms in defiance. Hopefully you can see that. He crossed his arms in defiance. He portrayed himself staring directly at the viewer, and he changed the title of the painting to Self-Portrait of a Degenerative Artist. And this act of defiance was quite powerful for me to read about. For the purposes of my novel, it was important for me to understand how the everyday person resisted the Nazis. And there's been movies and books written about large-scale acts of resistance, but for the everyday person, resistance took many forms, and I find that incredibly compelling. For my book, I needed to understand how a 12-year-old boy could resist, how a housewife could resist, how an everyday person in an everyday job could resist. So with Kokoschka's self-portrait, we see a painter resist as he knew how, through painting, and I found that extremely powerful. And the last painting I'd like to show you is called Paris Society by Max Beckman, and this was painted in 1931. And Max Beckman was a German painter, and he painted this particular painting from an invitation from the German embassy in Paris. And he started to sketch this in the late 1920s, but by the time it was completed in 1931, 1931, times had changed so much that he was accused of slander. And we see that it's a portrait of businessmen and intellectuals, and they're at a black tie party. As you can see, it looks and feels very disjointed and incoherent and very muddled. And the postures are kind of jerky, and the clothing is strange for the time. Something is just not right. And to me, the painting captures a society, what a society looks like in the midst of change and confusion, right as Hitler was being ushered in. And I use this feeling of uncertainty and turmoil not only when I thought about the German subconscious when I was writing my book, but I also used it when I was thinking about the newly clouded German Jewish identity of the 1930s. And I tried to inject this sentiment in both my German characters and my Jewish characters. Okay. Okay, so that's it. For the parents out there, I did want to mention that I've included a discussion guide at the back of the book. I've also created a much lengthier educator's guide with additional research opportunities. It's a good way to start conversations with younger people. It's available for free download on my website. And I want to thank you all for listening. It was a pleasure to present to you and to connect with you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Awesome. Oh my gosh. Thank you for all of that. It was so amazing to hear the behind the scenes. We do have some questions coming in. Okay. So the first one is, can you share an example of a misinformed or stereotyped question you heard others ask about Germany or German Jews?
Oh, that's a great question. And I had never been asked that one before, and so I'm eager to answer that. So when I was growing up, and I don't know if you all experienced this too, but it was, well, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you just get out? And it was such a complicated process. And I was so fortunate that in the early 30s, I did have some family who got out. Very fortunate about this. But by 1938, it was hard. It dramatically changed. The situation from 1936 to 1938 radically changed. And I wanted to flesh that out a little bit in my book to really show this wasn't easy. This wasn't even the beginning of the war, and Jewish people are already struggling to get out of Germany.
Yeah, you did. Amazing. Um, okay. While you were doing your research, did you find something that surprised you?
Oh, that's also a good question. So I have to say the favorite part of my research was talking to my family, particularly my grandparents. They had such a vivid memory of every little thing. Just even some of the sweetness, like some of the all the little things in their household. So I guess, they didn't really have refrigerators back in the day. They had something called like a cool room where, this is Germany and the climate is a little cooler. So it sounded like it was like a closet that they just opened the window and they stuck their like food that needed to stay cool in that room. There was something about, I'm not going to give anything away, but I added this a lot. There was most people, well, my family lived in Hanover, and they lived in these large apartment buildings. And so there was actually like a huge attic, which I did not add into my book, but there was a huge attic where you would take up your laundry and hang your laundry. And I actually had a family member during Kristallnacht, which just didn't make it in the book, so I'm not giving away any spoilers, hide in the attic. But it just, that part didn't fit in my story. But meanwhile, there were just all these, little crevices and storage rooms in the basement that apparently it was, if you're a kid, it's super fun to explore. So I guess, I mean, that was really the thing that was the most enjoyable, and I guess you can say it surprised me in my research. But I just loved hearing about all these little, daily life details about my family.
Amazing. Again. Okay. What were the most difficult parts of this book to write about? Did you have to step away because of the heaviness? How did you decompress?
Yes, and yeah, I did. I didn't realize. I didn't know I would have to do that. The book took me a long time. Number one, I was teaching myself how to write. Number two, I was doing extensive research. And number three, I had to take mental health breaks. And even well before I was writing, I had heard actors say when they are cast in a part, they sort of live in that part. And sometimes, it could really negatively affect them if you're dealing with a hard topic. So I had to live in 1938 Germany for years and years and years, and I just had to step back. And it's one thing, I mean, it's a heavy topic for anyone, especially as a Jewish person, but this was like my family stories. So sometimes it hit me, and I just had to not think about that period of time for a month, and then I could come back to it. Mhm.
I bet. Okay, the next one is, what do you want the readers of your book to take away from reading it?
That's a great question, and I want them to reflect on their own lives, um, not just there. I'm saddened to say Jewish people still, there's a lot of discrimination, and we hear in the news there's a lot of discrimination against other races and cultures as well. So how can we use what learning happened in my book, and how can we use it to reflect on today and move forward?
Yeah. Um, do you think you will write another book about this time period?
I maybe now, and that answer has changed over time in regards to two questions ago, where after I finished writing the book, I needed a big mental health break. And so this is my only book published, but I did write another manuscript, which is currently being subbed out with editors right now. And I did a complete 180. It was contemporary science fiction, and I just needed the distance. And I sort of wrote that, and it felt a bit cathartic. And then after I finished, I am really interested in this time period. So I'll say maybe. There's a couple of snippets. Actually, there's one really interesting story and about my grandmother. Sadly, she's passed now. I kind of wish I had this idea when she was still living, because she loved to talk about it. She was able to get out of Germany in 1939, and she went and lived in Amsterdam for about a year and a quarter, and then eventually made her way over to the United States. And while she was there, she picked up table tennis, like ping pong, and she loved it. And she like won this, I don't know what she won, but she had these little trophies, and she was hot stuff back in the day. And that's fascinating to me, to have a little German Jewish girl move to a foreign country, pick up, a sport, excel at it, make a million friends. And then she was actually, and the story, as she told me, when they finally got their US visa, she was so sad to leave. She had friends, she had a life. She was so sad to leave Amsterdam. And I thought that was such an inspiring story on so many levels, for a young person under those odds, fleeing from what she fled from, to be such a success, in her life. And I love that. So that's a little something I'm thinking about maybe one day.
That's beautiful. Um, okay. Have you been to Germany as an adult? If so, did it influence your writing? And if not, do you plan to? And what would you like to see while there?
Yeah. No, I've been back a couple times as an adult. I have my non-Jewish family still living there, so I visited them. And I mean, this is a complicated question, and I feel like every Jewish person and every German Jewish person needs to sort of like have their own evolution of their feelings and their connection to modern day Germany. And I feel like mine, to be honest, I feel like mine was expedited because I was so close with my German Jewish grandparents, and they so, I don't want to say they forgave, but they reconnected with the country that they felt so incredibly betrayed by later on in life, and had a good relationship. And they were able to separate modern day Germany from 1940s Germany. And so I grew up with that mentality, after all they went through. And when I go there, I feel more comfortable than not. I mean, there's certainly a divide between the East and the West, and I can't, certainly in West Germany and in Berlin, I feel like it's New York. Like I feel like it's very comfortable, and it's someplace I can hang my hat, and I could go in the middle of the square and be like, I'm Jewish, and people be like, oh, great, that's fine. That's not the case everywhere in Germany, and this has been my experience only. And again, everything, this is such a personal um, connection each Jewish person has to have with Germany. Um, on their own timeline. But yeah, I've had a good experience, and I will continue to go back.
Excellent. I have a question about the title. Can you tell us a little bit of how you chose Crushing the Red Flowers as the title? Did you
Yeah.
come first? Was it? I would like to hear about that.
So, well, the original title was not good. It was well, it was Mohnblumen, which is basically poppy flowers, the German word for poppy flowers, but that doesn't mean to anything, in English. And so, I definitely wanted to keep something with poppies because there's so much symbolism. As you know, poppies are traditionally they are the symbol of World War One, like a battlefield during World War One. And I took liberties with that symbolism, and I stretched it to that time period between the two wars, between World War One and World War Two, to represent that entire time period. So when I say crushing the red flowers, it means the end of an era. We're beginning now. 1938 is completely new. That's what I meant by crushing the red flowers. But I mean, if you read the book, the poppies do make their way in some subtle ways, like throughout the book. Poppies also to me represent sort of like childhood innocence. So crushing the red flowers is sort of like losing your childhood innocence.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I love it. Okay, we have another. Please, let's see. Thank you for sharing your writing process with us. Can you tell us a little bit about the process from your completed draft to being published?
I would like to talk about my newer novels because it's so much, more glossy and glamorous, and because I actually know what I'm doing now. But this was my first novel, and I wrote short stories before. I wrote short picture books, just shorter projects. When you write a novel, and you got like a flavor of that when I showed my post-it note planner, there's so many threads you need to keep track of, and weave together seamlessly. So there's a huge learning curve. And I would, write, and then I would teach myself, and then I would write, and teach myself. And it was messy. And now I know to do the characterization grid for all my characters before. I sort of learned that halfway through and how to go back and fix things. Now I know to do my post-it note planner before, not during. So it's much more elegant now, and it doesn't take me that long anymore. But that's basically the process.
Okay, excellent. Okay, let me put my glasses on. Okay. Um, I think this is from a younger person, perhaps. So
Great.
maybe a little, you might have to read between the lines. How much did your social psychology help in that the Nazis used social psychology to sell their Nazi campaign?
Okay. So I thank you for that question. I feel like that sort of like requires a thesis answer, like an academic thesis answer. But yeah, I mean, there was a propaganda minister, and um, really, unfortunately, the Nazis got this right, to further their own cause early on. Propaganda and communication, and blaming Jews and scapegoating, and they did this from early on, and it tragically it's effective to do. Um, so yes, they absolutely use social psychology. They absolutely use terrible techniques, and it was effective for them.
Okay. Um, so I was also wondering, I don't know, I don't want to spoil anything, or I can read a little. I have it tabbed. You have described so beautifully a very special magical place early on in the book that ends up being constant throughout. And I was wondering, you talked about the different art forms that inspired you. What did something specific, or did you know the place already in reality, when you described this beautiful magical place that was beyond the path and with the river and the water? Did that come from a painting or something that you already knew?
I think it's just that feeling that you got, that sort of feeling of transcendence, with nature. I've had that here and there in my life. But no, that's not one place. I would love to stumble upon that one day. That would be that's sort of, my utopia place. But no, I tried to cobble together. I actually did in my research. I tried to make sure, because I wanted everything so historically accurate. I just wanted to make sure, something like this could exist. I couldn't find that specific place outside of Hanover, but it could exist. And I was looking at topographical maps and rivers and stuff like that. But yeah, a field of poppies and some big trees and a stream absolutely could exist.
Yes, it was perfect. Um, I know sometimes novels switch between two different points of view, two different characters. I was wondering, how did you decide that that was going to be the format of the book, of Emil's character and Friedrich's back to back, each chapter flip flopping? How did you
Yeah.
do that?
Yeah, so that was actually one of the first decisions I made. It's not just a book about 1938, what one character went through. I wanted two very divergent characters, young people, and I wanted them to go through very similar things to see what their perspective would be like. So that, I don't think the book would be as strong if I just chose to write it in with one character. I think it works because you're seeing a child who is in the Hitler Young Folk, and you're seeing a German Jewish boy basically go through the same things. And I had to try to be very careful with my timeline because I'm writing for children. I really needed to, because I was jumping around with perspectives, I needed to honor a linear timeline, or I thought it would just be too confusing. So that got a little tricky in some parts, but that was still doable.
I agree that it made it made it flow in a way that I don't think it could have otherwise. So it's perfect, just the way it is. Okay, and I think this is the last question. How did you come to the ending? How did you know that that was the final few paragraphs?
I love that question. I've had that question before, and I love that question. That totally wasn't the ending. So the problem was, when you write children's literature, there are very specific requirements for word count. What I wrote is something called middle grade, and the word count should really be between roughly 40,000 and 60,000 words. When I got done with my book, it was about 70,000 words. So I that was totally not the ending, because that's um not quite, it's hard for me to talk about this because I don't want to give away any spoilers, but something similar happened to my grandparents, but then the story extended. And so when I had originally thought about it, I thought about capturing all of the events, but it really would have been about a third longer. And it wouldn't have sold. It wouldn't have been a children's book. The word count would have been way off. And in fact, I had to whittle down some words to get it closer to 60 than 70. But that's a great question. So I had to find a way to neatly wrap it up and quickly and make it fulfilling. And even though that wasn't the true ending of my family, but it echoed the journey for my family. But I just didn't have any more words to write.
Oh, that's amazing. And very interesting. Well, thank you. I mean, this was amazing to have you here tonight and coming to our community. It's been a really wonderful conversation. And to our guests, thank you for joining us today and for supporting our programming. We've put a link to purchase Jennifer's book, Crushing the Red Flowers, in the chat box to make it easy for you to get your own copy. And if you please stay tuned for just a few more moments, we have some closing slides featuring some upcoming programs. Thank you.